Clara's mornings began with the same unshowy rhythm, a kettle whistling, the soft scrape of a chair on tiles, the hush of a neighborhood waking up. She loved the ordinary, the orange glow of dawn on her curtains, the silent prayer before she dressed, the way she folded her bed cover with two precise tugs. In that deliberate tidiness lived the sense that she could make life behave, at least within these walls. Richard came like a bright, expensive wind into that careful order, tailored suits, loud laughter edged with the sweetness of praise. "You're different, Clara," he would say, fingertips lightly tapping her chin as if blessing her. "You make me feel calm." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe her quiet was enough for a man so charged with motion. In public, he was gentle in the ways that photograph well, opening doors, lifting her hand at events, a hand at her back that told the room, "She's mine and I'm protective." In private, his affection was sometimes restless, as if still scanning the world for applause even when the curtains were closed. Clara learned his rhythms, the messages that must be answered immediately, the smiles that must be maintained at dinners, the invisible ledger that tallied her gratitude. The first time she wondered if he loved her silence or loved how her silence framed him, she put the thought away like a too-daring dress and chose loyalty. She ironed his shirts, listened to his victories, and held the soft part of herself like a candle she shielded from wind. When he teased her about her small dreams, she laughed as if in on the joke. "I like my life small," she said. "Small things are easier to protect." He kissed her hair. "I'll upgrade you," he promised. For a while, the promise sounded like music. When he said, "I'll teach you how to live large," she answered, "Teach me gently," and he laughed, not unkindly, but like a man who already pictured the headline. The quiet knew a name, Clara. The bright noise knew another, Richard. And together they made a room where both believed they would not be swallowed. The black car arrived on a Thursday afternoon like a trophy at her gate, sleek, polished, humming faintly as if already approving its new owner. Neighbors came out with questions their eyes didn't hide, camera phones tilted in the sun. Richard stood by the hood with a grin that flashed like a billboard. "For you," he said, handing her the keys and with them an announcement. "Say thank you properly." He meant in front of them. Clara smiled, stunned and warmed, and a little dizzy by the generosity, and said, "Thank you," in a voice that trembled at the edges. He kissed her forehead, and the moment photographed itself into the gossip archive of the street. Later, in the shade of her living room, the paperwork came. "Just formalities," Richard said, sliding forms across the table. "You know how these dealers are, endless signatures." She signed what looked like standard registration and insurance addenda, trusting the hand that guided the pen. "Don't worry," he said. "I've handled the heavy parts." For a while, the car felt like confidence on four wheels. She learned its buttons one by one, set the radio to quiet stations, whispered thanks to the air for this proof that something in her life could be glossy, could be smooth. But on certain evenings when Richard drove, he spoke to the dashboard as much as to her. "I made this happen," he'd say lightly, then add, "You're not like the others, someone worthy of what I provide." When she offered to contribute to maintenance, he scoffed, "Don't reduce the romance to receipts." Weeks later, after a small argument about her spending, the car was a sentence he could use. "Remember who gave you that," he said, not loudly, but with a softness that landed like a fist. She said, "I remember," and added too quietly to hear, "I also remember what I signed and what I did not." It began with nicks in the paint, no one could see, but her, small remarks said with a smile, private corrections that would be jokes to the uninitiated. At a dinner, when she spoke on a topic she understood, he squeezed her hand under the table and answered for her, adding detail that vaguely contradicted her point. "She's still learning," he told the table, a fondness polished for public display. In the car on the way home, she said, "I felt small." He touched the steering wheel. "Not small, protected. The world can be rough." That word lingered like cologne. Protected. "I didn't ask for protection," she said softly. "I asked for partnership." He sighed dramatically. "Clara, I can't be auditing my tone at every dinner. Trust me." Trust me became the neat ribbon on boxes she hadn't asked to unwrap. He began to talk about upgrading her wardrobe, then upgrading her circle. You must be seen with people who reflect where we're going, he said. She asked where they were going. Up, he answered, flicking the indicator like a punctuation mark. Always up. When she wanted a weekend to visit her aunt, he frowned. We have a client brunch. Cancel the trip. You're my +1, and it matters. She canceled. In the quiet after, she held the phone to her chest. I'm allowed to want things that don't include you, she whispered into the airy room, surprised to hear it out loud. Even the car seemed to listen. Later that week, during a small quarrel about finances, he said, I don't know why you act like you carry this relationship. I carry us. I carry your comforts. She swallowed. I carry us too, Richard. He smiled the way a person does when a child declares, I will move a mountain. Let's not argue, he said. It's not attractive. On the morning the relationship ended, the air itself felt like glass, transparent, hard, ready to cut. He arrived early, unannounced, walking through her doorway as if it were a showroom. We should talk, he said. That neutral tone that meant a decision had already been framed. Clara folded her dish towel with care. Then talk. He paced the length of her living room as if measuring it for a narrative. You're good, Clara, but we've plateaued. I need someone who understands the pace I'm moving at. Someone who already is where I'm headed. She stared at him. And where am I? He shrugged. Grateful, comfortable, but not formidable. The word bit like cold air. So this is about your reflection, she said. You need a mirror that flatters you. He laughed once, no humor in it. Don't make it ugly. You'll be fine. I'm not heartless. I'll make sure you're not stranded. She clenched her hands. I'm not a project, Richard. I'm a person. When he left, he did it with choreography. A brief, almost ceremonial hug. A promise couched in a threat. Don't make this complicated. A glance at the black car as if assessing a future clause. A new woman waited in his passenger seat, fresh laugh, fresh perfume, the kind of smile that trusts the driver knows the way. Clara watched the car roll away, felt the stillness afterward like a room where a chandelier had been removed and the ceiling remembered its bare bulb. She cried the kind of tears that leave no sound, wiped them with the heel of her palm, and told herself a sentence she could live inside. You will survive this. That evening she put on soft music, put the kettle on, and opened her laptop. She applied for jobs. It felt like picking up tiny stones to build a road. Rejection letters came like weather, some curt, some gracious, all arriving with the steady impartiality of systems that do not know you. Clara built a calendar out of hope. Interview here, aptitude test there, a small victory when a recruiter actually called back. She learned to speak about herself without apologizing. I'm meticulous, she said in one room. I'm resilient, she said in another. I learn fast and I keep records. Each claim tasted strange at first, like trying on a coat someone told you was yours. Then, on a clear weekday morning, she sat across from a pair of eyes that actually saw her. A bank's hiring manager asked precise questions, the kind that respect the time you've spent. We need someone steady in the finance operations unit, the woman said. It's not glamorous work, but it's important. Clara felt something unclench. Important is enough, she said. The first weeks were humbling. She learned the bank's back end, the rails beneath the sleek surfaces customers touch, the dashboards where risk lives, the protocols that keep money honest. She liked the quiet rigor of it, the way numbers behaved if the rules were clear. Her supervisor, careful, rule-bound, noticed. You have a good eye, he said once, tapping a file she'd reconciled. She went home at dusk with tired shoulders and a small, clean pride. When she passed the black car under the awning, she felt no pang, only a soft vow, to never again let a gift be an invoice against her worth. She called her aunt, who laughed and cried into the phone. You're doing it, Clara, her aunt said. One good thing at a time. That night, Clara slept without a dream, the first restful night in months. Healing, it turned out, was as procedural as banking, a series of quiet, correct actions. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that leaves no fingerprint. Clara pulling a bundle from the queue, logging into the credit systems portal, cross-checking collateral schedules. A familiar surname snagged her eye. She froze, blinked, looked again. Richard. Her pulse skittered, but she kept her face neutral, aware of the office's hush. This was not a moment for theater. She followed procedure. verified the customer profile, opened the linked facilities, and began to reconcile entries. The screen told a story she had not written, multiple facilities, a pattern of delays, and a luxury vehicle finance agreement with arrears that bled across months. She read slowly, the way you read a letter from a once-loved person, line by measured line. The system flagged the account for partner action, meaning the finance company they serviced was nearing repossession. Her throat tightened. She took a breath that remembered every time he had said, "I carry your comforts." She did not gloat. She did not send a screenshot to a friend. She did not even allow herself the satisfying cruelty of imagining his face if he knew she knew. She printed nothing. She left no trace beyond what the job required. She cleared the reconciliation task, updated the notes with the bland, professional language the work demanded, and moved the file forward in the correct internal lane. That evening, she walked home with the sun low and gold and chose to tell no one. In her kitchen, she set down her bag, leaned both palms on the counter, and whispered, "Life does its own math." Then she straightened, cooked rice, and placed tomorrow's clothes on the chair by the door. Power, she was learning, does not always roar. Sometimes it sits, patient, with a straight back. There is a kind of justice that burns hot and fast, and another that keeps its own calendar. Clara chose the second. She kept her head down and her logs clean, answered emails with crisp sentences, and took her lunch at the same modest cafe where the owner already knew she liked extra pepper. When the finance company's formal letter moved through the partner channel toward issuance, she saw it in the system like a far boat coming closer. Her supervisor paused by her desk one morning. "That batch?" he asked. "All reconciled," she answered. He nodded. "Good, keep process tight." Process was the shield. She stayed inside it. At home, the black car sat where it always did, an object unworthy of an argument with herself. She kept it maintained, kept it insured in her name, and kept the facts where they belonged, filed, not flung. Still, the past has a way of knocking even when you have changed the locks. A mutual acquaintance mentioned, in a whisper of gossip Clara did not solicit, that Richard's circles were thinner now, his nights louder, his temper closer to the edge. Clara said nothing. "You hear?" the acquaintance prodded. "I didn't ask," Clara replied gently, and the conversation folded. When the letter was finally printed and sealed, official paper, official stamps, she felt no triumph, only gravity. She placed the envelope in her locked drawer with a steadiness that surprised her. "This is not revenge," she told her reflection that night. "This is truth on paper." She slept lightly, not because she feared him, but because she respected moments that change a story's direction. In the morning she woke before her alarm, brewed tea, and watched a single bird draw a black line across the sky. "I will not be baited," she whispered. "If justice comes, it will come wearing its own shoes." Rumors travel in cities like wind in hallways. Every door feels the draft. 2 late notices became 4. A deal that should have closed didn't. A travel photo on Richard's feed drew comments that whispered, "But with what money?" Clara did not look, but other people brought the news the way people bring storms. Fascinated, half afraid. She answered with silence. Then, one Friday, a letter arrived at her home address, Richard's counsel demanding the return of his black car within 7 days. She read it twice, let her breath settle, and placed it on the table. When the phone rang, his voice followed, rehearsed and curt. "You've had enough time to enjoy what isn't yours. Be reasonable." She kept her tone even. "We both know reason has nothing to do with how you've behaved, Richard." It chuckled. Clara, you can't win this." She pictured the sealed envelope in her drawer and said only, "We'll see." The next days moved with the metallic rhythm of anxiety, but she did not deviate. She went to work, caught a bus, balanced a spreadsheet, ate oranges in the break room, washed her dishes. At night, she pulled out the folder that contained her own car documents, the purchase receipt bearing her name, her contributions recorded in patient ink. She rehearsed her evidence aloud, as if speaking to the quiet table would make her voice ready. "You told me it was yours," she whispered to the empty room, "but you knew it wasn't the whole truth." When she slept, it was shallow, a surface rest broken by the thrum of imagined knocks on her door. She woke with a resolution that felt like iron in the mouth. If he came, she would not tremble. She would be kind to herself. She would be precise. She laid out her clothes as if for a ceremony. He did not come alone. The knock that shook the frame was followed by the weighty hush of men who bring paper like a weapon. When Clara opened the door, Richard stood a step ahead of two lawyers in dark suits, faces composed, briefcases clasped like verdicts. The air had the strained politeness of a waiting room. "Clara," Richard said, voice agreeable in a way that said the opposite. "Let's not make this theatrical. Hand over the keys." She stepped aside, gestured to the small dining table. "We'll do everything at the table," she said, and her voice surprised her with its clarity. One lawyer began reading from a prepared text, ownership assertions, claims of gift, obligations, a confidence that assumed the room. "Do you understand?" he asked, finally looking at her. "I understand what you're saying," she replied. "I do not agree that it is true." Richard's smile was a mirror tilted to dazzle. "Clara, show a little gratitude." "I'm being civilized." She folded her hands. "Gratitude is not about surrendering to a lie." The second lawyer slid a document forward for her signature. "Acknowledgement," he said, clipped. She glanced at it without touching the pen. "No," Richard leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You will embarrass yourself. Don't drag this out." She inhaled slowly, letting the breath heat her sternum and cool her face. "I'll bring something for you to read," she said, and stood. In her bedroom, she opened the drawer. The sealed envelope lay there like a heartbeat finally ready to speak. She returned to the table, laid the envelope in the center, as if placing down a truth that could not be argued into silence. "Before you take anything," she said quietly, "read this." The head lawyer broke the seal with the irritation of a man expecting irrelevance. He scanned the letter, then stopped, eyes climbing and falling, climbing again. Color drained in slow motion. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Richard, this is..." Richard snatched the page, skimmed it, then gripped it as if he could squeeze out a different reality. Clara said nothing. The official masthead of the finance company sat at the top like a cold moon. Beneath it, the words ordered the repossession of Richard's own luxury car for non-payment, arrears listed, dates precise, steps imminent. The room's noise changed. The distant generator buzz suddenly loud, the tick of the wall clock insistently counting the old arrogance into a corner. Richard tried a laugh that didn't land. "This is some clerical." The lawyer's quiet cut him. "It isn't." He turned to Clara, not hostile now, but careful. "How did you?" She kept her eyes on Richard. "I work at the bank that partners with your lender. The truth arrived without me asking." For a beat, no one moved. The second lawyer gathered the papers he had brought as if the act of tidying could reset the scene. "Given this development," he murmured, "our position is..." "Changed," the head lawyer finished, voice flat with professional dread. Richard's face collapsed by inches, the practiced calm, the thin disdain, the posture of a man who believed all rooms were his. "Clara," he said softer now, almost pleading around the edges, "you don't have to." "I don't have to what?" she asked gently. "Tell the truth." She slid her own folder forward then, a copy of the purchase receipt for her black car, maintenance logs, insurance in her name. "I am not taking anything from you," she said. "I am simply not giving you what is mine." Outside, a neighbor's baby cried, then quieted. Inside, the lawyers exhaled the surrender of men who know when the ground under their feet belongs to someone else. Richard stared at the letter as if its ink were still wet, as if his gaze could dry it into a different story. But paper, like justice, wasn't persuaded by his old tone anymore. The days that followed the confrontation left Richard restless and unable to sleep. He replayed the moment over and over, the lawyers looking down at him, Clara's calm voice cutting through his arrogance, and the repossession letter that had stripped him of his shield. For a man who lived on image, the humiliation was more than he could bear. He had always relied on appearances, the polished suits, the glossy cars, the expensive watch that caught the light at every handshake. Now, stripped of that illusion, he walked around his home with the heavy silence of defeat. His new girlfriend, Angela, noticed the cracks. "You've been distracted," she murmured one night, scrolling through her phone. He snapped back, "Don't start with me." She closed her phone, eyes sharp. "Don't snap at me, Richard. I didn't sign your loans." He glared but said nothing. Pride had always been his currency, but Clara had exposed his account as empty, and he had no quick way to refill it. Meanwhile, Clara moved through her days quietly but firmly, still committed to her work. Her colleagues noticed a slight change in her posture. Her steps carried a composure that spoke of someone who had stared down humiliation and survived. She did not tell them the details, but when her supervisor complimented her thoroughness, she simply said, "Sometimes we learn strength from what almost breaks us." At home, she made herself tea, read her devotional, and looked at the black car parked in her compound. It was no longer a symbol of manipulation, it was proof of her resilience. When her aunt called to ask how she was doing, Clara answered softly, "I am learning that silence and patience are not weakness, they're preparation." Her aunt sighed with relief and said, "Then you are already winning, my child." Clara smiled, not because she felt triumphant, but because she finally felt free of the weight Richard had tied to her life. The inevitable day arrived when Richard's luxury car was taken away. The finance company's agents came early, their uniforms neat, their paperwork unshakable. Neighbors gathered as they always did, whispering in corners and peeking through windows. Richard rushed out of the house, half-dressed, demanding explanations. "You can't do this. I'll make the payment," he shouted, his voice hoarse. The lead agent, unmoved, replied, "Mr. Richard, you had more than enough time. This is standard procedure." Richard's words turned into pleading, then threats, but the agent stayed firm. The sound of the car engine, as it was driven away, echoed like a funeral bell through the street. Children pointed, women shook their heads, and the men muttered about pride. For Richard, the sight of his prized possession leaving his compound under another man's hand was worse than any insult. He stood frozen, fists clenched, but powerless. Angela, standing on the balcony, watched with folded arms. When Richard finally stormed back inside, she spoke coldly. "So this is what you've been hiding." He glared at her. "Don't you dare judge me. Do you know how much I've done to maintain this lifestyle?" She shot back, and look where it got you. You don't even have a car anymore. What are you without the show? His silence confirmed what she already suspected. Within a week, she was gone, leaving behind only a short note. "I didn't sign up for this." Richard crumpled the paper in his hand and sank onto the sofa, his head in his palms. For the first time in years, there was no woman to flatter his ego, no car to parade, and no lawyer to silence the truth. Outside, life moved on, but inside his home, pride had been repossessed along with his luxury. At the bank, Clara began to rise. Her diligence, patience, and steady hands earned her recognition among colleagues. One morning, her supervisor called her into the office. "Clara, we've been impressed with your work. You're not just thorough, you're dependable. We'd like you to train some of the new recruits." Clara blinked, humbled but ready. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice steady. She had once been the woman who doubted her place in every room Richard walked into. Now, she was the one others looked to for guidance. She stayed late at times, teaching younger staff how to reconcile difficult accounts. They admired her calmness, her ability to explain without condescension. A younger colleague, Sarah, once whispered, "You make me feel like I can handle this job." Clara smiled warmly. "You can, just take it one detail at a time." At home, Clara's evenings became more peaceful. She no longer checked her phone with the anxiety of waiting for Richard's messages. Instead, she cooked, listened to soft music, and occasionally drove out to visit her aunt or run errands. Every time she drove her black car, she felt none of the old burden. The car was hers, and so was her dignity. She thought about Richard less and less, not because the memory was gone, but because it had lost its power. One evening, as she parked by her gate, a neighbor approached. "Clara, we're proud of you. You carry yourself with grace," the older woman said. Clara blushed slightly and answered, "Thank you. I'm just living my life." But inside, she knew it was more than that. She was building a life untethered from the shadows of manipulation. For the first time, her reflection in the car window looked like someone she respected. Richard's world shrank rapidly after the repossession. Friends who once crowded his table at restaurants stopped answering his calls. His phone, once buzzing with invitations and deals, grew quieter each week. He tried to borrow money, but no one trusted him. "You're reckless, Richard," one former associate said bluntly. "You live like money has no tomorrow." That night, Richard stared at the ceiling, his chest heavy with the reality he could no longer ignore. He was a man who had built his reputation on borrowed bricks, and now the walls were falling. In desperation, he tried reaching out to Angela, but her number was disconnected. Alone, his home felt like a museum of faded grandeur. Clothes hung unused in closets, watches gleamed but meant nothing, and the silence mocked him. He thought about Clara more often, not with affection, but with bitter regret. "She embarrassed me," he muttered to himself, pacing the living room. She turned the tables. Yet, deep inside, he knew it wasn't Clara who had destroyed him. It was his own pride, his lies, his inability to live within truth. Still, admitting that out loud was too painful. One evening, he called an old friend to complain. "She works at the bank," Richard said, voice sharp. "She must have leaked something to ruin me." The friend sighed. "No, Richard, you ruined yourself. Everyone knew your debts were piling up. She just didn't cover for you." Richard hung up, furious but unable to argue. The truth sat heavy in his chest. Clara had not betrayed him, she had simply let the truth breathe. Clara continued to grow at the bank, but something deeper began to shift in her heart. She was no longer simply surviving, she was discovering her own worth. One Saturday afternoon, she attended a staff retreat where team members shared their journeys. When it was her turn, she hesitated, then spoke softly. "I once lived in someone's shadow, believing I owed them my gratitude for everything. But I learned that what is yours cannot be taken away by someone else's arrogance." The room was silent, then filled with nods. Sarah, sitting in the back, whispered to another colleague, "She speaks like someone who's walked through fire." Clara smiled faintly and sat down, her heart lighter. It wasn't about Richard anymore. It was about reclaiming the narrative of her life. Her aunt noticed the change, too. Over a dinner of jollof rice and fried plantain, her aunt clasped her hand. "You look different, Clara, stronger. I can see it in your eyes." Clara chuckled softly. "Maybe because I finally believe my own voice." Her aunt leaned closer. "Then keep speaking, my child. Life listens." Clara went home that night with tears in her eyes, not tears of sorrow, but of gratitude. She had been broken, but now she was whole in ways she hadn't known possible. The black car parked in her compound wasn't a gift anymore. It was a symbol of how far she had come. And each time she looked at it, she whispered to herself, "I am enough." Richard tried to keep up appearances, but the facade crumbled faster than he could patch it. He attended a party wearing his best suit, but he arrived in a taxi, and whispers followed him. "Where's the car?" Someone asked aloud, mockery hidden behind a smile. He forced a laugh. "In the shop for upgrades," he lied, but the smirk on the man's face told him no one believed him. Throughout the evening, he drank heavily, his laughter louder than necessary, but his eyes carried defeat. When he stumbled home later that night, he caught sight of his reflection in a store window. For the first time, he didn't see confidence, he saw desperation. He muttered bitterly, "What happened to me?" But the silence had no answer. At home, the emptiness of his house pressed in on him. He picked up one of his luxury watches and slammed it onto the table. "What's the point?" he growled. The trappings of wealth no longer covered his losses. Alone, he replayed Clara's calm voice in his head. "I am simply not giving you what is mine." That sentence haunted him. It stripped him of excuses, forcing him to face the fact that she had been stronger than he ever gave her credit for. He began to realize that the humiliation wasn't in losing a car, it was in losing the illusion that he was untouchable. The man who once commanded rooms with arrogance now sat in darkness, surrounded by objects that meant nothing. Months later, Clara's hard work earned her another promotion. She was now entrusted with overseeing a larger portfolio of accounts, a responsibility that came with respect and recognition. Her supervisor announced the promotion in a staff meeting. "Clara's consistency and dedication have set a standard for all of us," he said proudly. Applause filled the room, and Clara smiled, humbled but assured. After the meeting, Sarah hugged her. "You deserve this more than anyone. You've taught me what real strength looks like." Clara held her tightly. "Thank you. Just promise me you'll also believe in yourself." Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening. At home, Clara allowed herself a quiet celebration. She cooked her favorite meal, lit a small candle on the table, and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Looking at her reflection in the window, she saw not the timid woman who once lived under Richard's control, but a confident, independent woman who had rebuilt her life from ashes. Later that week, she drove her car to church, parked calmly, and stepped out with dignity. People noticed, not because she flaunted, but because her peace radiated naturally. Clara was finally recognized not for what someone gave her, but for what she had built with her own hands. Richard, on the other hand, was drowning in regret. He had tried reaching out to old contacts, but no one wanted to associate with a man whose debts overshadowed his promises. Sitting in his now quiet living room, he thought about Clara. He remembered her patience, her loyalty, and the way she once looked at him with admiration. For the first time, he admitted to himself, "I ruined the only good thing I had." The admission tasted bitter. He picked up his phone, scrolling through their old photos, but every picture reminded him of the man he used to be, a man who had believed he was always right. "Clara," he whispered into the empty room, "I should never have let you go." But regret is a poor substitute for repentance. Instead of humbling himself, he sank deeper into bitterness. When a friend suggested he apologize, he snapped, "She humiliated me in front of my own lawyers. How do I come back from that?" The friend shook his head. "By admitting you were wrong, Richard. That's the only way." But Richard could not. His pride, though shattered, still wrapped around him like chains. He wanted Clara back not because he loved her, but because he hated what losing her had made him see about himself. And so, instead of healing, he sank further into the pit of his own making. Clara's life slowly blossomed in ways she hadn't expected. She began to travel for work, attending conferences where she met professionals who respected her not for her appearance, but for her intellect and composure. At one conference, a senior manager from another branch told her, "You speak with clarity and confidence. Have you considered leadership training?" Clara smiled shyly. "I never thought I'd be the type." He shook his head. "You already are." Those words stayed with her. When she returned home, she started journaling her journey, writing down the lessons she had learned from heartbreak, humiliation, and resilience. Writing became therapy, a way to honor her past without being trapped by it. One evening, her aunt visited and saw the journal on the table. Flipping through it, she smiled proudly. "Clara, this is a book in the making." Clara laughed softly. "It's just my way of remembering where I came from." Her aunt touched her cheek gently. "Then keep writing. Someday others will need this." Clara's eyes misted, realizing that her pain could become a light for others. The woman who once felt silenced by Richard's arrogance now held a voice strong enough to inspire. Slowly, a new chapter of her life was being written, one she owned completely. Richard and Clara's paths crossed unexpectedly one afternoon outside the bank. Richard looked worn, his once polished suits now slightly frayed, his face carrying the lines of sleepless nights. Clara stepped out of her car, poised and confident. For a moment, he simply stared, disbelief clouding his face. "Clara," he said softly, almost pleading. She met his gaze calmly. "Richard." He swallowed, struggling for words. "You look different." She tilted her head. "No, Richard, I look like myself." He tried to smile, but it faltered. "I've made mistakes," he admitted. "I thought I was untouchable." Clara's eyes softened slightly, but her tone stayed firm. "And now you see that no one is." The silence between them stretched, filled with all the things unsaid. Finally, Richard asked, "Do you hate me?" Clara shook her head. "No, I don't hate you. I pity you. Because you had everything you needed, and you lost it chasing shadows." He winced, her words cutting deeper than any insult. He wanted to say more, but the dignity in her eyes silenced him. Clara adjusted her bag and said, "Take care of yourself, Richard," before walking into the bank. He stood there, watching her disappear into the building, realizing he had lost more than a car. He had lost a woman who had found herself. And for the first time, Richard felt the weight of what true loss meant. Weeks turned into months after Richard and Clara's unexpected encounter, yet the weight of that meeting lingered like an echo in Richard's chest. He avoided the streets near her bank, avoided the familiar cafes where they once sat together, and yet everywhere he went, her composure haunted him. At night, Lying in his dimly lit apartment, he would whisper her name into the silence as though she might suddenly appear. "Clara," he said one night, gripping his pillow like a lifeline. "You should have been mine forever." His voice cracked with longing and shame. Pride had once been his constant shield, but now it felt like chains around his neck, choking him every time he thought of what he had lost. His world had grown smaller. His phone no longer rang with invitations. His table was no longer crowded with friends pretending loyalty. And in the absence of the noise, he was forced to listen to the truth. He had built his empire on lies, and Clara had seen right through them. One evening, as he passed by a car dealership, he stopped to stare at the gleaming models behind the glass. His reflection stared back at him, aged, weary, stripped of arrogance. He murmured under his breath, "I used to be the man who owned the road." Then he shook his head, eyes wet. "Now I can't even own myself." Clara, on the other hand, had mastered the art of moving forward without bitterness. Though the memories of Richard sometimes tried to creep into her quiet moments, she refused to let them anchor her. At work, she was invited to sit in on board-level meetings where her insights began to influence real decisions. "Clara," her director told her after one meeting, "your clarity of thought is rare. You don't just see numbers, you see people in the numbers." She smiled, humbled. "Thank you, sir. I only speak from what I've lived." Outside the bank, her life blossomed in quieter ways. She reconnected with old friends she had once neglected, began attending evening classes in leadership, and even joined a community book club where her calm voice was often the one that settled debates. One evening, as she sat in the circle, a woman asked, "Clara, you always sound like someone who's walked through storms. How did you survive?" Clara smiled gently and replied, "By remembering that storms don't last forever. You either drown in them, or you come out knowing how to swim." The group sat in silence, taking in her words. For Clara, each day was no longer about surviving Richard's shadow. It was about stepping into the fullness of her own light. Richard's attempts to regain stability collapsed with every effort. He sought to revive his old contacts, but doors that once opened at the sound of his name now closed before he even knocked. When he tried to meet a former investor at a downtown lounge, the man looked him in the eye and said, "Richard, you're finished in this town. You burned every bridge and thought no one noticed." Well, we all noticed. Richard's throat tightened as he whispered, "Give me one more chance." The man shook his head. "Chances ran out with your last loan payment." Richard left the lounge with his shoulders slumped, walking aimlessly under the city lights that once sparkled for him. The taxis that splashed water onto his shoes reminded him of his fall. By the time he reached home, he felt like the walls of his apartment were closing in. He sat in the dark, staring at a bottle of whiskey on the table. "This is what's left of me," he muttered, unscrewing the cap. But even the drink could not drown the memory of Clara's steady gaze and the repossession letter that had ended his performance. Every night he battled with himself, torn between calling her to beg and holding on to the last fragments of pride that kept his apology locked in his chest. Meanwhile, Clara's journey was marked by recognition that extended beyond her workplace. She was invited to deliver a short talk at a professional women's seminar, and though nervous at first, she stood before the audience with poise. "I once believed my worth depended on someone else's validation," she began, her voice carrying quiet conviction. "But I learned that dignity is not a gift, it is a decision. No one can repossess what you build for yourself." The room erupted in applause, and women approached her afterward with tears in their eyes. "Thank you," one said, gripping her hand. "You've given me courage to leave a situation I thought I couldn't survive." Clara squeezed her hand gently. "You're stronger than you know." Later, as she sat in her car outside the venue, she reflected on how far she had come. The woman who once trembled at Richard's words was gone. In her place stood a woman who understood that resilience is built, not given. She bowed her head and whispered a prayer. "Thank you, God, for letting my pain become someone else's strength." Richard's loneliness deepened until even the silence of his bedroom mocked him. He had once laughed at Clara for enjoying quiet evenings, but now he would give anything for someone's steady presence in his home. One night, unable to bear the emptiness, he picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. His thumb hovered over Clara's number, and his chest tightened. "She won't answer," he muttered. But the ache pushed him to dial. The phone rang once, twice, but then went to voicemail. He left no message, only sat there with tears welling in his eyes. "I drove you away," he whispered into the empty air. "And now you won't even hear my voice." He lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling until the dawn light painted the room in shades of regret. The man who once thought he owned everything was now owned by his memories. Clara, however, was experiencing new beginnings. Through her community connections, she had begun mentoring young women at a local training center, sharing her story in private sessions. "I was once told I was nothing without him," she told a group one evening. "But I found out I was more than enough on my own." The girls listened intently, some wiping tears, others nodding in relief. One asked softly, "Did you forgive him?" Clara paused, then answered, "Yes." But forgiveness isn't about excusing someone, it's about freeing yourself from their control. That night, as she drove home, she felt a deep peace settle in her heart. Forgiveness had closed the chapter Richard thought he still owned. It was no longer about what he had done, it was about what she had overcome. She parked her car, looked up at the stars, and smiled. "I am free," she whispered, and this time the words felt like wings. Richard avoided mirrors for weeks, but one morning he caught his reflection in the bathroom glass and froze. The face staring back at him was tired, worn, and older than his years. It touched his cheek, whispering, "What happened to you?" Memories flooded in, Clara's laughter in the early days, her tears the night he left, and the repossession agents driving away with his pride. He slammed his fist on the sink, trembling. "You destroyed everything, Richard. You destroyed yourself." For the first time, the truth was undeniable. His arrogance had not only cost him Clara, it had cost him the very identity he had built. He collapsed onto the floor, sobbing, "If only I could go back." But time had no reverse gear, and regret was a cruel mirror that showed him only what was lost. Clara, on the same morning, prepared for a leadership workshop. As she adjusted her blazer, she caught her reflection in her mirror. This time she saw strength in her own eyes. "You made it, Clara," she whispered with a small smile. At the workshop, she spoke passionately about resilience and leadership. One participant asked, "What's the greatest lesson life has taught you?" Clara paused thoughtfully before replying, "That no matter who tries to break you, they cannot take what you've decided belongs to you, your peace, your dignity, your future." The audience applauded, and she felt her heart swell with gratitude. As she drove home later, she thought of Richard only as part of her past, a chapter that had ended long ago. For Clara, the mirror no longer reflected pain. It reflected purpose. News of Richard's decline spread quietly but firmly through the circles he once dominated. He attended a business event hoping to reconnect, but whispers followed him like shadows. "That's the man who lost everything," someone muttered. Richard tried to force a smile, but when he extended his hand, people avoided his gaze. The humiliation was suffocating. He left the event early, clutching his coat tightly around himself as though it could protect him from their judgment. That night he sat by his window, staring at the empty driveway where his car once stood. "They all worshipped me when I had it," he murmured bitterly. "Now they spit when I walk by." His pride, once his armor, had become his prison. Meanwhile, Clara was invited to speak at a regional banking forum. Standing at the podium before hundreds, she shared not only professional insights, but also personal resilience. "Sometimes life takes what you thought defined you," she said, her voice strong. "But in the process, it gives you what truly matters: character, integrity, and courage." The hall erupted in applause, and afterward, senior executives congratulated her. "You have a gift," one remarked. Clara smiled softly. "It's not a gift, it's survival turned into wisdom." That night, as she returned home, she looked up at the sky and whispered a prayer of thanks. She had once been the woman humiliated by Richard's arrogance. Now she was the woman people listened to with respect. Late one night, Richard finally surrendered to the weight of his regret. He dialed Clara's number again, his hands trembling. When she answered softly, "Hello," he froze. Her voice was calm, steady, untouched by his chaos. Clara, it's me, he stammered. Silence followed before she asked, "What do you want, Richard?" His throat tightened. I wanted to say I'm sorry. I was blind, I was cruel, and I destroyed everything. Can you ever forgive me?" Clara's heart clenched at his words, but she remained firm. "I forgave you a long time ago, Richard. But forgiveness doesn't mean returning to what broke me." His breath hitched. "Then what am I supposed to do?" She answered gently, "Find yourself, Richard. That's something I can't do for you." And with that, she ended the call, tears welling in her eyes, not for him, but for the man he could have been. Clara sat in silence afterward, her heart heavy yet at peace. She realized that closure wasn't about him acknowledging his wrongs. It was about her knowing she no longer needed his validation. She whispered to herself, "I am whole." Across town, Richard sat in the dark, the silence of her final words echoing in his mind. He buried his face in his hands and wept. For the first time, he understood that his downfall was not Clara's victory. It was his own undoing. Clara's life expanded with new opportunities. She was nominated for a leadership award within the banking sector, a recognition of her resilience and excellence. At the award ceremony, she walked onto the stage in a modest but elegant gown, her confidence radiating through the hall. As she held the plaque, she said, "This award is not just for me. It is for everyone who has been told they are not enough. Your worth is not defined by someone else's opinion. It is defined by your courage to stand even after you've been pushed down." The audience gave her a standing ovation. Clara smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had finally stepped into a future she had once doubted was possible. Richard heard about the award through whispers on social media. He stared at the photos of Clara on stage, glowing with dignity, and felt a pain sharper than any loss he had known. "That should have been my moment," he muttered, but deep down, he knew it never could have been. Clara's light came not from wealth or show, it came from endurance, something he had never learned. He shut his phone off, the image of her smile etched into his memory like a reminder of everything he had lost. Richard's debts mounted until creditors knocked at his door with demands he could no longer ignore. He sold furniture, watches, and even clothing just to survive. Each sale felt like peeling away another layer of his pride. One afternoon, as he packed items into boxes, he whispered bitterly, "I once had everything. Now I have nothing." When a creditor threatened legal action, Richard sank to the floor, clutching his head in despair. His downfall was no longer whispered, it was now written in public records. He had reached the end of his performance, stripped bare before the world. Clara, on the same day, was signing a new role that would oversee a regional office. Her colleagues congratulated her warmly, and she smiled with humility. That evening, she visited her aunt and said, "Life has taught me that loss is not the end. It can be the beginning of something greater if you don't let it define you." Her aunt hugged her tightly. "You are living proof of that, Clara." Clara nodded, tears in her eyes. She had turned her pain into purpose, while Richard had allowed his pride to destroy him. Richard disappeared from the social circles that once adored him. His name was no longer spoken with admiration, but with pity. He lived in a small rented apartment, the man who once flaunted luxury now reduced to obscurity. In his final days of relevance, he wrote a letter he never sent to Clara. "I should have cherished you," he wrote with shaking hands. "You were the only truth in my life. I hope one day you remember me kindly, though I don't deserve it." He folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer, where it remained unread. For Richard, the end came not with noise but with silence, a quiet farewell to the man he had pretended to be. Clara never saw the letter, but she felt no need for it. She had closed that chapter long ago. Her focus was now on the future, on mentoring, on leadership, and on building a life defined not by what she had lost, but by what she had gained. She stood on her balcony one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, and whispered, "I am free." The wind carried her words into the night, sealing the final page of a story that had once tried to break her. Years later, Clara stood as the keynote speaker at an international leadership summit. She walked onto the stage, her presence commanding yet humble, and the hall erupted in applause. "Life is not measured by what we possess," she began, her voice steady. "It is measured by what we survive and who we become afterward." I once stood in the shadow of arrogance, but I chose to walk into the light of resilience. That choice changed everything. The audience leaned in, captivated by her words. When she concluded, "True justice is not always loud. It is often quiet, like a repossession letter that changes everything," the hall thundered with applause. Far away, Richard lived in obscurity, forgotten by the very people who once sang his praises. He carried the weight of his regrets alone, haunted by the choices that had brought him low. Clara, however, thrived, not because she sought revenge, but because she chose healing over bitterness. Her story became a testament that dignity cannot be taken, it can only be surrendered, and she had refused to surrender hers. As she left the summit that evening, surrounded by admiration and respect, Clara knew she had finally reached the place Richard had always chased but never found: peace. Here's the Bible verse for the story. "For the Lord detests the proud, but the humble will inherit honor." Proverbs 29, verse 23, moral of the story. Pride builds illusions that eventually collapse, but humility and resilience establish foundations that cannot be shaken. Clara's dignity endured because she chose patience, truth, and self-respect over bitterness. Richard's downfall was not caused by others, but by his arrogance and deceit. The lesson is clear. What is built on lies will fall, but what is anchored in integrity will stand forever. Closing prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the reminder that pride leads to downfall, but humility and integrity bring lasting honor. Teach us to walk in truth, to value dignity over possessions, and to trust in your justice even when we are wronged. Strengthen our hearts to forgive, give us wisdom to stand firm in righteousness, and help us to use our trials as testimonies that glorify you. May our lives reflect your grace, and may our victories be rooted in your will. In Jesus' name, amen. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching.